Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a very special guest with us today. Dr. Dominic Wyse is in England right now, and it's evening there, and he was so kind enough to meet with us. It was not easy scheduling, but we thank him for being here with us and his wonderful assistant, Monica, who helped us to get the date and the time. So thank you so much. So I'd like to introduce you to our guest. Dr. Dominic Wyse is a professor of early childhood education, and he is with the UCL Institute of Education. He is a researcher. He has a paper called the Balancing Act Initiative, Teaching Reading and Writing. And he has a book as well called The Balancing Act. And he had written that with Charlotte Hacking, I believe. And the article that we're looking at today came out in the conversation, and it's England's synthetic phonics approach is not working for children who struggle to read. Now, this is a really controversial topic, and this is why we wanted to have Dr. Wyse with us today, because what we hear in the United States is that England far surpasses us as far as what they're doing with phonics. And from what I knew about England, lots of other countries followed. And it always seemed to be a leader in this area. So we would like to know why you say that. What's the reason for this statement that it's not working for children?
Faith, can I interrupt for a second before we go there? Can you also remind our viewers what our value and promise for this episode? What are our viewers going to get out of this? I want to make sure that we stick to our core values too.
Okay. So our hope for this episode is that there will be some clarity for our teachers about practices in the classroom, because from what we hear, teachers must have a phonics period for early childhood. At least that's the way it is in most of our schools now, that there are mandates. And we want some clarity about what this new research is showing us. And as far as what we're promising our audience, we're promising you a dynamic conversation that is not slanted in one direction or the other. Now, Judy and I might have our own views about this, but we're not researchers, and we're trying to get to the heart of what we hear, what's out there, what's most recent, and we welcome comments and questions. So if you could explain to our audience, Dominic, what was the reason you had written this article? I know about your book, The Balancing Act, and it pretty much aligns to what this article is. You're not too pleased with the push for this synthetic phonics, and only maybe it's part of a bigger picture. We'd like to find out.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's amazing to be able to talk to people. I dare say one thing we can all firmly agree on is we care about young children. We care about them learning to read and write because we know those things are one vital component in them succeeding in life. So, and the other thing I'm going to say straight away, because sometimes I am mischaracterized in terms of my views. I'm, first of all, I would say systematic teaching about the alphabetic code, if we're talking about an alphabetic language, is essential. It's one essential part of what we should be doing. Now, I think I can say that and at the same time have some very critical remarks to make about some practices, some policies. And yes, in the Balancing Act book with Charlotte Hacking, as you know, it very roughly divides into two halves. The first half is around the debates. It's looking at a range of theories. We developed our own theory, the double helix of reading and writing. It does look a little bit at the politics as well, because I think whether we like it or not, politics has been part of the reading debates for at least 100 years. And that has, positive and negative consequences. And it rather depends on which particular person is writing or speaking about the debate and what their view is, how well informed they are, critically, how open-minded are they? And one of the things I've found, I've been researching and thinking about how children learn to read and write for more than 30 years. I began my career as a primary school teacher. I worked in 3 inner city schools in England, worked in London, Bradford and Huddersfield. So I taught in some of the most deprived areas in England. Now, please don't put me in front of a class of children today, because I would definitely have a lot of learning to do to remind myself of all the wonderful things that teachers do, quite apart from teaching reading and writing, all that you need to keep children motivated, engaged, behaving well, learning. So having said that, that's kind of, I guess, a few caveats, really. The basic problem, one of the problems in England, and there is clear evidence of this, is the number of children who don't meet what are the expected standards for reading. And the piece that you mentioned in the conversation drew on a piece of research that we've carried out. We started about 2.5 years or more ago. We began with a survey of as many teachers as we could encourage to complete the survey in England. As it turned out, the sample was relatively modest, but they were nearly all very, very experienced teachers, and some of them had more than 30 years classroom experience, as we know from the survey data. But we did more than that. We really wanted to map the field, to look again at the evidence and say, okay, what does research tell us about what are the best ways to teach children, particularly those with reading difficulties? And so when we began what we call the Balancing Act Initiative, we began with typically developing readers, and partly because a great deal of research, quite rightly so, has been about children who struggle with reading. But we also felt that thousands, if not millions of children were being subjected to certain practices because government said they had to be, and yet they could read perfectly well. I find it rather interesting. I mean, I'll come to some of the data in a moment, but I find it interesting when I speak to people who are passionate to the point of being extreme about synthetic phonics. They will never concede one iota that synthetic phonics can be done really badly, even if it's done with the best of intentions. They will never concede that actually it can be very, very boring.
Wait a minute.
I have to stop.
There she goes.
And I have to give you a cheers, because one of the things that Judy and I talk about is extreme views. And you know what? There's always some truth in something. There's always something that we really have to stop and pause. And what you said is so true. I'm going to give you a cheers.
Wait, so Faith, let's just recap for our audience. What are you cheering about exactly?
I love that he said that, people who believe in synthetic phonics, and I'm one of them, I think there is value in teaching explicit phonics instruction, but you know what? It can be taught poorly. And, it's not a guarantee. Just because you have synthetic phonics and the government says you have to have it doesn't mean it's going to be taught well. And I think that's something to cheer about. We have to make sure that teachers are doing what is asked of them well, and they know the ins and outs and how to pivot if it's not working.
Yeah, thank you. And that's reminded me of something else that's happening right at the moment. So one of the government committees in the Houses of Parliament, the Education Committee, has just launched a new inquiry. They're incredibly worried about, there is now strong data showing that children in England, their motivation for reading has declined hugely. In fact, my research centre, the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, we put in a response to this inquiry. And we focused on our area of expertise, which is, of course, pedagogy and curriculum and assessment. But we're interested in, what are the best ways to help children learn to read and write. And we've made the point that, government has to take seriously that the actual pedagogies that are being recommended in policy, even though they want children to love reading, could be having a negative effect on their motivation. Let's face it, I'm sure every teacher on this podcast will know that if you relentlessly teach one thing day in, day out, up to an hour every single day for 3 whole years of a child's early primary school, they're going to be bored. If you sit them on a carpet and drill them relentlessly with, this is a phoneme, these are how you represent this phoneme. Now, I concede that there are relatively imaginative ways that synthetic phonics and other systematic phonics can be done and is being done. But the basic fact that all human beings know is we get bored if we do things repetitively for too long. So I just wanted to mention that inquiry because it's absolutely happening now. They've done the call for evidence. We don't know. They haven't even convened any meetings yet. So we're right at the beginning of that. And I think it'll be interesting, particularly when you said in your early remarks about England being something of a trailblazer. Now, I agree with you on that. And in fact, the first chapter in our book identifies that what we see as an international trend. And since we wrote the book, we've had lots of people in all different parts of the world contacting us and saying, yes, we've got something similar happening here, whether it's Scandinavia, China, although rather different picture in China, which is really interesting for all sorts of reasons. Obviously, the USA, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, is any influence justified? Now I get to the point which we began with, which is, why do I think things are not right in England? Well, since it's now, I think for 10 years, at least 25% of children in England are not meeting the expected standard. And worse still, a proportion of that 25% are not even reaching the lowest score on we run statutory obligatory tests for all primary school children in England. And a significant minority, we're talking about, certainly since 2019, about 5,000 children are not only not meeting expected standards, but they're really, really struggling. That is in spite of a decade, more than a decade, of the strongest, most controlled national experiment to make sure that synthetic phonics is taught first, foremost, and only. And that's where I disagree with what this government it's the former government, actually, in fairness, has done. Yes, as I said, systematic phonics is important, not necessarily synthetic. Systematic phonics teaching is important. But the data from these children tells me we really do need to, at the very least, make sure we do better for those children. And the paper, on the basis of analysing some of the most robust kinds of research, if you want to know what works, so randomised controlled trials. Yes, there's a debate about every kind of research method. If I had another day with a different hat on, I could talk about that forever. But let's now say we agree that a randomized controlled trial is a reasonable method to use to test whether an approach works. There are now hundreds of these studies. In fact, thousands. I mean, we found 40 peer-reviewed systematic reviews. Each review will have begun with a sort of thousands of hits and whittled them down to answer their research questions. More than 40 focused on children with reading difficulties. So we have really very solid evidence. We don't have the final answers because, of course, the human brain and the child's developing brain is an incredibly complex thing that we're still trying to understand. But nevertheless, we have some very clear pathways, if you like. Most of all, what we know, and this is one of our main findings, you need multiple component approaches to help children with reading difficulties. The golden bullet, the one hit wonder, which is synthetic phonics, simply doesn't work. And what's
may I just stop you for a second? Judy, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I don't see you. You're not
Really?
visible. No, you haven't been. I didn't want to interrupt Dominic, but
Oh, I see everything. And I see me and I see all three of us.
well, I don't see you. Dominic, do
Oh.
you see Judy?
no?
No, we don't see you.
Oh,
Anyhow, Judy, we talked about multi-component reading instruction.
we sure did, Faith.
This is not the first time that this has come up, Dominic. And, you know, I want to hear from you, Judy, what your thoughts are, because, you know, we've talked about multi-component instruction, and I have never really had a clear understanding about how this is vastly different from what was in place. So we had whole language, we had balanced literacy, now there's multi-component reading instruction, and we've spoken to lots of people who have different thoughts on this. And I know, Dominic, from reading your work, that you believe in contextualized phonics. So,
Faith, you know what I think is important? There's so many terms, and, you know, we have to make sure that our listeners understand fully
yes.
what all these terms are, like synthetic phonics, systematic phonics. Now you said another term. I think norming it is very important. And then I have like 7,999 questions that came up since we're 17 minutes in. My head is definitely on fire with questions because we've heard multi-component, and we heard that there was research that said multi-component is not that effective, that I remember. Faith, wasn't that the case at some point?
Well, I think this is where I want to go with Dominic, that it seems that we all will agree, I think we can all agree, that teaching all the components of reading are very important. I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is, how do we do everything all at once? Do we emphasize a phonics approach early on? Do we have two separate domains that we have to make sure we hit, language comprehension and phonics simultaneously?
Faith, can we go a step back? Let's just norm all these terms. We said so many terms for our listeners.
Okay.
Let's go, let's take this in baby steps so that we can make sure that we're all on the same page, especially our listeners today.
Yeah. So, Dominic, if you could maybe clarify, I think Judy's right. Let's clarify terms to start. So we have whole language, we have balanced literacy, we have multi-component reading instruction, and then you talk about contextualized phonics. So taking an authentic book and teaching phonics from a book.
And also the synthetic phonics versus other types of phonics.
Yeah.
Would you mind doing that, please, for our audience?
Not at all. So if I begin, my paper with Alice Bradbury in 2022, the kind of one that unusually for a researcher hit all the headlines and caused a lot of discussion. We described three main approaches. I think, you know, it's fair to say that in the past, for example, Jean Charles in the USA, going back a long time, sort of said there's basically two: there's bottom up or there's top down, where top down would be beginning first and foremost with whole texts to engage, and then unpicking things like the way the alphabetic codes works, the way grammar works, the way spelling works to some degree. And then bottom up was just focused first and foremost on cracking the alphabetic code. Now, we think now there's really three main variants. You mentioned whole language, yes. So whole language teaching was very much about beginning with whole text, real purposes, first and foremost. And then I think it's fair to say that although there was some phonics teaching involved, it wasn't systematic. So it was serendipitous.
Can I just say something also? I don't know, Dominic, if you know about me a little bit, my history. So I just wanted to let you know, I was formally trained in read and recovery. I think that's why our podcast is so interesting. I was trained in 2013, did that role till 2017. So like that was a big part of my life. But I think the reason that I'm here is because, you know, there were so many kids that I instructed using that approach. And I know that it didn't work for a lot of kids, especially in the decoding piece. And that's why I became so passionate. Now, does that mean that everything that I did in the former approach didn't work? Absolutely not. There were many pieces that I know were aligned with the science and research, but I really strongly know that the data for the students in the US is moving forward. So this is like so confusing a little bit for me, this like discussion, because like in the United States, all of a sudden we're finally gaining traction. We're finally seeing better results for kids with balanced literacy and whole language. We had really stagnant scores for years. I mean, years and years, maybe like over 20 years, scores were like terrible in this country, and we're finally seeing gains. So like this whole discussion, I get it, but it's still like I read the article and I was like, wow, this is like contradicting so much of the work that we're doing now. And I kind of get some of the pieces because that was my past life, but I definitely hope that we could dig really deep into this as we get deeper.
Well, I've not recently, I did in a couple of years ago, and I've kept an eye on the trends in the PISA and PEARLS studies. And I've tracked the progress of the USA along with a lot of other, you know, high income regions and countries where the English language is taught in primary schools. I don't see any evidence so far that the United States is in any better place than it was. Now, you're probably talking about your internal statistics, which I know vary enormously from state to state, but I can't be drawn on that because I haven't looked at those statistics recently. I'm certainly aware there are states where things appear to have gone really well, but that's cherry picking individual states. You'd have to look properly and rigorously at the whole picture. What I have done is present to you data I do know about, and I've said quite clearly the data's there. And by the way, as we said, every single child in England sits these tests. 25% of children are not meeting the expected standard. And we've had a decade of synthetic phonics, which, as you've said, is regarded by some people as exactly the right approach. So, but what I was doing, in fact, was you asked me to define some key terms, and that's what I'm going to carry on doing. So that was whole language. Now, balanced literacy. Some people absolutely inaccurately claim that balanced literacy is the same as whole language. I've seen this repeatedly in the media. I've seen it, even some academics saying this. It's absolute nonsense. You know, we've known for more than a decade that balanced literacy, balanced instruction, balanced teaching is not the same as whole language. There are whole books about this. It's very clear. I knew this even when I was a teacher. I understood the distinction between whole language and balanced literacy teaching. I think what we've done in our book, though, is try and present, I mean, there's nothing new in the world in a way, but what we have tried to do is present an up-to-date, research-based, theory-based and practice-based clear account of what balanced literacy is and what it is not. And I remember in the book, we actually take this on, you know. Now, the other variant, though, is synthetic phonics. So it's no longer, you know as well as I do, that the American National Reading Panel concluded that there was no statistically significant advantage for any one form of phonics teaching over another. So in other words, there was no evidence that synthetic phonics was necessarily the only way to go. What was clear was the alphabetic code has to be taught systematically. By the way, that begs a whole series of questions, because it still doesn't answer, how much, every day, how long every day. Now that's where we really don't have solid evidence. I am aware actually of one really unusual systematic review that looked exactly at what they call dosage. I think that's an unfortunate medical analogy, and that takes us down, I think, difficult kind of concepts. But they concluded that 40 hours duration of instruction was the maximum that you should do, in inverted commas, to children with reading difficulties without changing the approach. So if you've done 40 hours and it's not worked, you have to change the approach. So I thought that was interesting. But that, of course, depends on the class you're teaching, the group you're teaching, the individual you're teaching, etc., etc. There are many complexities around that, but nevertheless, they did try and actually establish this rather clear picture around the amount of time you need to help children with reading difficulties. So the next thing you asked me to do was clarify between systematic and synthetic. Systematic phonics means a much broader range of ways of helping children understand what is important in terms of the alphabetic code. And so, whereas in synthetic phonics, lessons always begin with identifying a particular phoneme first, then how you might represent that phoneme with different combinations of letters. Systematic phonics programs take different approaches. For example, they might begin with a sentence, with a word, with a particular phoneme in a word, and look at it that way. They include attention to, particularly for younger children, for phonological awareness, and so on. So there are, and by the way, one of the things that I've paid particular attention to is looking at all these randomized controlled trials. Previously, people hadn't bothered to look really closely at what was the intervention. If it was a positive, if it was statistically significant and a positive effect, what was the intervention? What was it like? Who delivered it? So, for example, across these studies, lots of them, possibly even the majority, are actually delivered by research assistants or by what they call para-teachers, not delivered by the children's class teacher. So, there's lots of complexity, and obviously for the purpose of today, I have to try and distill things. But inevitably, with each of the questions you're asking, there's a range of complexity. However, I think there is an important. In fact, I did a paper with neuroscientist Usha Goswami in 2008, and this was one of the points we made. This was when England was just beginning its journey, if you like, into much more narrow synthetic phonics. We made the point that the government has started eliding, systematic and synthetic, and just saying systematic synthetic phonics. So that kind of got them off a slight awkwardness, where we said clearly, no, it does not have to be synthetic. There are many ways to help children learn the alphabetic code. Okay, so that's two areas of definitions, if you like, helping your listeners, viewers understand, what the way I'm thinking about those terms. I forget what we were coming to next.
Well, okay, so I'm listening and I'm taking this all in. And Mike, I have a couple of questions. One is, how do you do this in a structured way? So this is confusing to me. Clearly, you agree that it's important for this type of instruction to be systematic. But if you're pulling it from, let's say, authentic text, how are you then going to make it structured so that there is a cumulative effect of building skills? That's where I'm confused, Dominic. And the other part of this is, I asked about, the definition of contextualized phonics. So if it's multi-component instruction,
Yeah.
Is the contextualized phonics part of the multi-component approach? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, thank you. Unusually, normally I'd find that question quite hard to answer because I'm not a practitioner, I'm a researcher. However, you find me in the unusual position where we've just finished planning 8 weeks of a brand new intervention for children with reading difficulties. We've literally written the manual for teaching assistants we're aiming at, because in England, for good or for bad, it's teaching assistants, not teachers, who help children who are most in difficulty. I mean, I think there are some issues there. You know, you train teachers to be professional, knowledgeable people. It strikes me the kids with reading difficulties are the ones who need the most expert people, and they end up with not that. I'm not saying some teaching assistants are brilliant, by the way. And let's face it, you know, there are many parents in the world who, through instinct, help their children learn really well. Anyway, so the way we agree that it needs to be systematic. So the way we've done it is, first of all, we identified a series of books that we know because mainly because of Charlotte. Actually, Charlotte Hacking, my co-author, is one of her many areas of expertise is text for children. Which are the ones that are likely to engage children? And remember, in the middle of our double helix is this idea about children's motivation for reading. By the way, the double helix is our new model and theory of, frankly, how to teach better. So we begin with planning which texts are going to be used. Obviously, they're age appropriate. There's a range of them. We need to account for, as much as one can, the fact that our classrooms are full of multiple languages, cultures. So to some degree, we're sensitive to books that are not just going to be, you know, one particular version of people and the world. They're age appropriate. Now, in each one of the sessions, and we've planned for 3 sessions a week, 2 small group sessions and 1 individual child session. In each lesson, there is some systematic phonics teaching. The sequence of phonemes, and we do think about, well, which phonemes do we think it would be good to do first in the program? I should say, by the way, this is aimed at children who are age 6 to 7. So that matters because, of course, in the Balancing Act book, there's a chapter where we deal with much younger children, phonological awareness and so on. So I am talking, you know, the point at which children have not succeeded, frankly, when they should have done. So I think Mary Clay was right, by the way. By the time children are 6, if they're not decoding simple real books, there's a problem and they need some help. So we identify the phonemes and the sequence of phonemes. You will recall that in the Balancing Act book, we have a table where we detail the order that we think would be sensible. This is one, by the way, to some degree that commercial synthetic phonics schemes have quite similar sequences. So we get the idea of sequence. But the key point about contextualizing this is, you know, a word is selected on a page of the text. So the children know enough about the context of the story or the information book or the poetry book. They've got a sense of what's going on. Hopefully they're excited and engaged by what's going on. And then after, you know, having discussed, you know, things like, why does this character think this? Why do they do that? What on earth is that object? Whatever. We are then able to say, oh, and now we're going to look at some of the technical bits of how the English language actually works. And so then we hone in on a particular word, a particular phoneme that we pre-planned, and the teacher then engages in some systematic teaching about the alphabetic code, but it's contextualized in, you know, a real book, something that's real to the children, something that makes sense, you know, making sense. It's the whole that drives everything teachers do, making sense. And I'm afraid in some of the, I was going to say extreme examples of synthetic phonics, I think we have far too many extreme versions of systematic phonics around the world. I know we have that in England, where we've got children spending an hour a day, as I said, having their heads, you know, banged with phonemes and letters every single day, and it's not working for the 25% of children.
Okay, so here, I mean, I have so many thoughts, like Judy, probably a lot going on, but could it possibly be that perhaps it's not working because the teacher maybe needs more professional development? Could it possibly be that children aren't getting enough practice or application in what they're doing?
I was thinking about the same things a
You
lot.
know,
The
rather
why
than
is always very
jumping.
important. The why and digging deeper. You know, how many times are those kids being seen? What does tier one look like? How much data are we collecting for those kids? Are we really progress monitoring those kids? Are we giving specific feedback to those kids? And you know what bothered me a little bit, and it's okay because it's the literacy view. You know, so I've gone through my own journey, right? I have my leveled books in my garage, and I didn't throw them out. Usually for me now in the latest couple of years, you know, I think that what was missing for me was a scope and sequence and following a scope and sequence that made sense so that, you know, I could give kids those books to practice. And now it's not like we had decodables for 6 years. It was for a short window of time so that kids didn't habituate these patterns of just guessing and seeing multisyllabic words when they weren't able to decode a CVC word. And it just seems so systematic and makes sense. You know, if we're working on this, now you're seeing it here. And, you know, not all decodables, and we've done many episodes on this on the Literacy View, were created equally. There are many quality decodables that I've encountered. I mean, there's tons that the kids enjoy and are meaningful. And I think the problem with, you know, using a variety of different books when kids aren't ready is A, it could habituate bad patterns. B, kids can start guessing and not knowing to slide at point of difficulty and to sound out words, because that was a very neglected skill in my reading recovery days. And, you know, a lot of the kids looked like they were reading, but as the years progressed on state exams and stuff, they had a very hard time because they were getting things off of meaning and didn't really know how to decode more complex language, and it was backfiring. And, you know, I find that many kids aren't bored by books that follow a scope and sequence. In fact, they feel very comforted because they learned this in isolation. Now they get to apply it. Now, does that mean that they don't see different type of books? No, they have read alouds. And when they are ready and showing that they know how to decode those words and can decode different, vowel teams and R control and different things, of course we can expose them. We don't want to keep those kids in decodable text for too long. But
right. So there are so many things now. You've got my head spinning, and there's so many things I want to talk about. But what you said there right at the end is absolutely crucial. In England, they do not stop getting synthetic phonics, whether they're readers or not. The national curriculum in England says they'll have it for 2 years. Okay. Now, if we're talking about anecdotes, then my own anecdote recently was a colleague who has a child who's, I don't know, around about age 6, cracked the code at a relatively normal, typical reading development, cracked the code, and is now literally being turned off reading because she's bored senseless by phonics. Because the government says, the national curriculum says, you have to keep going with your daily lessons of synthetic phonics. It's narrow. It's a narrow form of synthetic phonics, in my view. And that child is being damaged, in my view. I'm sorry, it's as bad as that. If you don't do what you said, which is as soon as they can decode well enough, we know that there's the self-learning that goes on. It's not just about what we teach them. It's a mixture. You've got to get them off, and you've got to get them engaging with text. You've got to get them increasing the sophistication of their comprehension. That is not happening. I'm not aware of it happening anywhere, actually, in any of the countries we've studied. Nobody has come to me and said, oh, of course, we get them off synthetic phonics as soon as they've cracked the code.
Mark Seidenberg said that. Dr. Mark Seidenberg said, get in, get out, move on.
Yeah, he's
I don't
right.
know how many people are getting in, getting out, and moving on.
And
But
Wiley Blevins constantly says the concept of it's a short window of
Yeah,
time, but the application is very helpful for kids. But then we move on. It's a
yeah,
short, tiny window of
yeah,
time for
yeah,
kids.
yeah,
But you know what? But let me ask you a question. Now, that child that's frustrated, how long is that window of phonics time? Is it 30 minutes? Is it like the whole, like I
yeah.
can't imagine that it's hurting a child if you're going deeper, if you are developing higher order thinking questions within your phonics block. There's ways to do that as well. There's ways to increase the rigor. So I just want to know a little bit more about that.
and could it also be for spelling, Dominic?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah,
that's the other piece of this.
yeah,
Like, I'm thinking, even if a child knows how to read, often that child needs way more practice for spelling, and they need that repeated practice to build, orthographic memory of the code so that they could, read by sight. There is orthographic mapping that we know is so important. And the only way to really do that is through practice. So, what are your thoughts about that?
yeah. Well, I mean, that's a very good point. But for me, what we know from the research on spelling is a whole set of other really important things children need to be helped to understand. So these range from the way words are structured, morphology, etymology to some degree once they're a bit older, but generally just a fascination with how, I mean, the English language is truly fascinating, and spelling is one of its fabulous and annoying for some people characteristics, isn't it? You've got the whole history of English buried in the spelling, and of course now we have solid variants. There's obviously North American English, there's British English, every different African country, nearly everyone probably has a different English, and so on. So yes, I agree. I certainly think that's spelling is one of those other massively important components that actually must be taught. Again, it can be taught really imaginatively, and it can be taught very badly. I mean, I'm sorry, but history tells us that doing a weekly spelling test and memorizing your spellings has been done for more than 100 years. Now, it has some limited benefits. It can be done relatively well, or it can be done really badly. But if you want to teach spelling in a way that's evidence-based and imaginative, there are many, many things you can do. And so I agree with you in the sense that I'm talking about a particular approach to synthetic phonics. You asked me how long. Well, to the best of our knowledge, it's between 30 minutes and 60 minutes every single day in every single primary school in England. That's the best answer I can give you. And that the problem we face, as I know also is a problem across North America, is very rarely does research get done which involves systematically finding out what huge samples of teachers are actually doing in classrooms. And that, I'm afraid, needs people who are expert enough to go in, watch lessons and talk to teachers. And it's expensive research, and that's why not a lot of it gets done. So second best may be surveys, and we've done some survey work, and lots of countries have. So I just think, I mean, by the way, this is not me saying it's all bad either. I am trying to highlight what I see as a way that we could do it even better. And I think what we were saying earlier, get kids off the synthetic phonics when they're decoding well. By all means, yes, progress into more work on spelling, for example, but much more than that. You've got to progress them in terms of their things like their reading motivation, how they understand different kinds of text. We all know that narrative fiction is so powerful for children, but also lots of children love nonfiction. Lots of children love poetry. And then there are all the artistic aspects and indeed all the other subjects of the curriculum, aren't there? That ultimately, you know, this should be seen as a very important skill. We need to nail it early on, as you've said, and then because we need to get on with the things that are even more important. And I do concede, you know, if kids don't learn to decode, of course they're not going to read, they're not reading. I mean, but what we do know for where we began today was children with reading difficulties, and we certainly know their needs are far from simple. And that's why I think, although I hear you when you say you've had good discussions about multi-component approaches, it's one thing to accept, and not everyone does, that that's what we need. It's quite another to then think, right, you mentioned, I agree with you, professional development for teachers. I mean, at the moment, my estimate is teachers in England really wouldn't understand what was meant at all by multi-component teaching and interventions. So there would be a big job there. So that does need significant professional development. Now, you also said, though, and this is quite right, that any failures in any system could be as a result of a lack of the right professional development. And I concede that, definitely. But you have to remember that England has had a very strong infrastructure. For example, hubs of schools, largely controlled by government policy, significant investment, trailblazer schools, helping other schools who are less expert to develop along the same policy lines of synthetic phonics, first and foremost. If it's not worked in a decade, it isn't right. It's quite straightforward. Your average person on the street understands that. They've had a long crack at this. You know, it's not the first time, by the way, historically it's been done. I'm sure you remember George Bush and the multi-million-pound investment in effectively synthetic phonics or science-based approach. It didn't work. The evidence is very clear on that. It didn't work.
But I was part of that. I was involved in reading first.
Yeah.
And I really think, because I was on the inside, there were a lot of things that were going on. It wasn't apparent to everyone, but, you know, a lot of schools took that money and then did not exactly follow what the procedures were supposed to be. They were layering different approaches. So, you know, like you said, Dominic, there are things behind the scenes that not everybody sees. And then,
and then Faith, what ended up happening after that is they decided, okay, that didn't work. Then they went the opposite direction and then trained everybody like me in reading recovery. Then they decided, oh, that didn't work. And now it's like, it's been this cycle, right, Faith, of this back and forth. This doesn't work, that doesn't work.
So agree with you, Judy. Here's something that I'm thinking. So Dominic, so I ballroom dance. I've been ballroom dancing for years. I knew nothing about ballroom dancing when I started. And I'm using this analogy because I really want to get into just a little bit of what you're talking about with multi-component. Now, clearly, ballroom dancing is multi-component. There's a lot going on there. There are the steps, there's arm styling, there's Cuban motion if you're doing Latin dancing. The point is that a teacher, starting with a beginner, would not start with arm styling, would not start with Cuban motion, because you can't get your hips moving before your feet are moving. Now, what I'm thinking in terms of just learning, right? Just kids being able to learn, that's cognitive overload, right? It's too much all at once. Doesn't mean you're not going to get to arm styling and to Cuban motion and all these other pieces. But if I were to be given something like that, when I first started ballroom dancing, I would have been out of there. I would be flying and saying,
you know what? That's funny that you mentioned that. And I think that's what was happening to a lot of beginner readers with the reading recovery method. There were these beginning readers, and we would say these 3 prompts over and over again. Does it make sense? Does it sound right? Does it look right? And that was so overload for a lot of beginner readers as well, Faith, similar to what you were saying. And because I was overloading so many of these youngsters, they didn't know what to do when they were reading, and their default was just to like guess based on pictures rather than read the words. And what ended up helping was structure. And I'm sure it relates, Faith, and you could correct me, that, you know, learning how to dance and learning how to be good at it, you need small bite-sized goals that follow an explicit teach, right, Faith?
And but yet be exposed. So part of it was every week we would be going to group dances. And I was at first a little intimidated, but you have to dance with other people. If you just dance with the same partner, you get used to those particular steps, kind of like decodable books. But then you have to branch out and have someone else lead you. But you don't do that at the very beginning because you would be just absolutely intimidated.
But what if they put somebody in the class, Faith? I'm just playing devil's advocate because it's kind of fun. What if you put somebody in the class that it's just they're more natural at it and they just got down and boogied faster? They didn't need that.
So they would be able to jump into those group dances a lot easier than someone who had no dance experience. And so I just would like to use that analogy with Dominic. So let's talk a little bit about this contextualized phonics, multi-component. I guess what I'm looking for, and I still have not gotten a really clear understanding, how do you determine what you're starting with at the beginning, when it's ready to move on, how much practice you need, and how you integrate all those other components in that we all agree matter, but it's just how it's being done. And how does the regular teacher out there, you know, just the person who's trying to get through the day, figure out how to do this? And data doesn't necessarily point you in that direction. It might say a child needs more phonics or more fluency, but it's not really helping you to sort through what's in front of them, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I have to confess, you've caught me off guard on the ballroom dancing analogy. Please don't ask me to ballroom dance.
You never know what's going to happen on the literacy view, Dominic. She could push the BS, she could cheer, or she could just say, poof, start dancing.
Oh dear, I would definitely get the bad buzzer. Well, first of all, maybe I'll try and tie together the thing you were saying about overload. So it's a very common, it actually is it's important research has shown things to do with cognitive overload. It's learning science. I'm certainly aware of some of that work. But let's look at this another way. So let's set the scene. A teacher, and you wanted me to talk about the teacher's busy day and how they're going to cope with all these multiple things. Well, teachers should have been doing this forever, should have been doing it daily. They choose a book that's appropriate for the children in their class, and it might be often it will be a story, a narrative, but sometimes it will be poems and sometimes songs and sometimes non-fiction, etc. And they read aloud to the class. Now, actually, cognitively speaking, if the children are attending to what that teacher is doing, fully attending, and by which I mean, first of all, they have to ignore all their friends who are messing around. They have to not be thinking about the lovely party that they've got at the end of the day. They have to be visually attending, orally attending. They then have to understand, literally understand, and metaphorically understand that if it's a good narrative, it will not only have literal meanings, it will have, deeper meanings and all kinds of interesting things going on. It will provoke them to provoke certain emotions in them, and they'll have to, not explicitly, but they will be dealing with different emotional responses, enjoying them maybe, worrying about things occasionally in an appropriate way. And then the teacher occasionally will stop and will ask questions and raise points and seek children's opinions, hopefully, if it's a good teacher, about the text and ask them to interpret. Now, what I've just described to you is multiple components happening at the same time. And for those people who say young children are not capable of certain things because it's all a bit too complicated for them. So let's break it down into Mickey Mouse little bits and pieces. I would say they don't understand teachers and they don't understand children. The human brain and the way that the human brain learns language is what makes us utterly unique to all animals. And it's an incredibly sophisticated, we learn all sorts. Every day the children are coping with bombardments of texts, voices, disagreements, agreements, physical needs, mental needs. They're constantly in a world of multiple cognitive events, and they, on the whole, not all of them, of course, some of them struggle in all sorts of ways, but on the whole, they deal with this fine. So I'm afraid, yet to be fully convinced that the best teaching is always the kind of teaching that you break down into minute, boring little parts, for which, by the way, it's very hard for the teacher to put those into a sequence that, unless they're really good, that the children will understand, well, what the hell is the purpose of this? What are we doing here? What's the big picture? Because if you lose sight of the big picture, you're not learning. And hence we anchor our multiple components around one simple thing, and it's called a text. And it's a text that's a real text. It's got purpose. It's constructed by a real author whose only interest in life is to attract young readers to the kinds of play, creativity, seriousness sometimes, and yes, learning. Of course, one of the books we've chosen in this new intervention we're developing deliberately plays with these ideas around what are phonemes and how do we learn about them, but done in a beautifully fictionalized way. So you've got every kind of learning under the sun buried in all of these incredible books. That the world of children's picture book publishing has exploded over the last decade. It's an astonishing place, and we're just depriving children of it because we're saying, no, you're too stupid. Let us break this down for you so that you learn. And the final thing I'll say on this is, even I do concede that for various reasons, teachers do need to chunk stuff up. And that's a natural part of good teaching, that you think very carefully about sequences and cumulative progressions. But there are also things in this is where I finally get to ballroom dancing. You'll notice how I've avoided it, particularly in the creative aspects of the curriculum. So I actually, in another life, I was a musician. I've taught more young people to play the violin or the viola than I can remember. And I've taught absolute beginners. I've taught young children. I've taught adults. I don't do it now, but I used to. So I love analogies with the arts, because you're right in my territory. Okay. I read, I'm afraid, it looked good in the first instance. And in the end, I was disappointed. It was a publication that came out recently in relation to England's national curriculum, the new review, and was basically rehashing a fair amount of learning science, a fair amount of cognitive learning science that's we already know about. It's been around for a long time, but it began with an analogy with music. And unfortunately, I think the people who wrote this were not musicians, and they appeared to be kind of using it to sex up the text a bit, probably realizing that it's sometimes a difficult sell, cognitive science. But if you take something that's creative, I hope we can agree that we want children to leave primary schools and secondary schools with at least having engaged with creativity, maybe having developed their creativity. And I'm talking about even, everyday solving problem creativity, not only artistic. Well, the way you succeed in being a musician, I'm sorry, although it's true you have to acquire certain skills, That does not mean a straightforward linear sequence where you begin with learning what the note A is, and then you proceed to the note B, and then you proceed to the note C. Because if you did that, children, and we know this, would say, well, I've tried learning the violin, I hate it, so I'm not going to do it anymore. And how do you stop that? You entice them into the world of what music making really is. Hey, you know that tune that you know well on the radio, that pop song? Well, there's a little bit of that you can play right now, even though you're a beginner. Oh, right. Now I'm hooked, you know. So, yeah, I've still not said anything about ballroom dancing. But...
Well, no, I don't think you have to know anything about ballroom dancing, truthfully. That was just an analogy to get us thinking about looking at where you begin. And the point is, you know, with dancing, with music, you do get the whole picture. You do see people dancing, you do try, but you can't really grow that way. And using your music analogy, my son's a musician, not that he does that for a living, but he's a musician, and he got to the highest level in piano and guitar in school. And at the beginning, he had a teacher who used pop music to teach him for motivation and interest. And then when he got serious, I had a classical pianist train him and said, that's terrible. Your fingers are in the wrong place. Your wrist is not up high. And he had to relearn everything because he didn't learn properly from the start. So I think there is, using your words, a balancing act that you have to start with something and get somewhat decent, proficient at it before piling in a lot of things, because then you get sloppiness. And it's then you have to relearn what wasn't taught correctly from the start.
Yeah.
I think we could agree on that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if your son had gone into the, say, the popular or folk music world, then actually they would have been better served carrying on. But of course, that's where young people make choices, and I certainly do know, because I've played with, well, my training was classical right up to the Royal Academy of Music, so I went quite a long way with it, and I did earn parts of my living for long periods of my life, you know, playing music. But I've also I know folk musicians and popular musicians who can't read music, but then they can do things I simply can't do. They can improvise in a way I can't. You know, unless I got the notes in front of me, you know, I'm a very good sight reader, but I can't do things by ear very well at all. So having said that, I do agree. The analogy, it has some similarities in that you definitely need to learn certain key skills. You definitely have to have a certain amount of knowledge, you know, about the system, if it's music or if it's the alphabet, you know. But really, all the debate that we're still wrestling with is, to what extent do we emphasize certain things above others?
Can I just go back to something? There was something that actually made me a little bit uncomfortable, if I have to be honest. You referred, and I don't know, maybe I didn't understand correctly. It was a while back. You mentioned the word stupid and making kids not making kids feel stupid. And that made me a little bit uncomfortable. And I don't know if I understood correctly or not. I don't think it makes kids feel stupid to teach them in a way that's explicit with a scope and sequence. And I think that it's helpful to have that, because that can show me, A, what the kids need. It could show me how to pivot in a respectful way. But I definitely don't see, you know, a more structured approach having any relation to feeling that kids are stupid. In fact, I think it's being very respectful. I think it's making sure that systematically we're not ignoring the needs of students, which I think the system did for a very, very long time. And I think getting back to the basics and showing kids how to read and the strategies and that they can use at point of difficulty, rather than just assuming that we that those kids have it would be a pivotal mistake. And I think that something that may seem simple to some people is not simple for our kids. I work in one of the poor school districts where it literally hurts my heart that the system didn't show these kids how to decode and how to read. And that's basically a crime against humanity, because what was ending up happening is they were getting to 7th grade, 8th grade, and not able to read. And I think that is systematic failure. And using the word stupid made me a little uncomfortable, to the point that I kind of want to cry.
Well, my point was that really, I think we're agreeing that what we shouldn't do is assume that children are incapable of learning before we've properly assessed what they really can and can't do, what they really do know and don't know.
That
And
we
then
can agree with 1,000%.
Yeah, and then, and by the way, I'm not against the sequencing and progression and so on at all. I mean, I think that is good. Good teaching is about very strong assessment and genuinely knowing your pupils and students, properly assessing them, rigorously assessing them frequently enough. And by the way, you know, the good teacher is assessing literally all the time. I mean, I can still remember sitting with individuals or groups of children and discussing, say, writing with them, realizing the stuff they did know, and then thinking, right, can I just help you with this? And then building that into sequences of lessons for the whole class or for a group as needed and as the assessments made me realize. But there are, I'm afraid, people who do, I think, assume that children can't do so many things, especially in the area of language. We have real problems with attitudes to the way children speak, therefore assuming they don't know stuff. We have real problems with the kinds of knowledge, you know, this, again, we've not really talked about the whole industry of what is knowledge and all that stuff. Again, there are some views that are along the lines of, look, sequence it up, you know, decide what they need to learn, tell them what to learn.
You know what I'm going to say, you know, I'm grateful for you saying that, because I can agree with you about that 100%. I think we can't assume 100%. We can't assume what kids know and don't know without really getting to know our kids. We shouldn't always tell our kids. But I think the important point that you do make, Dominic, is, yeah, we do have to monitor our data, whether we're using, you know, systematic phonics or synthetic phonics, or if we're using multi-component. How are we making those decisions, and are we ready to pivot for our learners? And you know, you do make so many interesting points. Like, you know, sometimes I'll even see, you know, we'll have classes that are getting a phonics lesson, and it's 30 minutes of phonics, and there's kids that know how to read in the class. So is that the best use of their time? How can we make that the best use of their time? And I've also seen lessons where I saw a dictation lesson today, right? It was part of a phonics lesson. It was in a different language, which was interesting for me to watch. But I saw there was a kid in the classroom. He wasn't getting it at all. They were writing phrases, and he's having trouble with phonemic awareness in English and in Spanish. And now there was a big waste of his time too. Was that the best instruction for him at that moment? Was the teacher providing that student enough feedback? So I think that no matter what you're using in that classroom, basing everything in feedback and knowing those kids and knowing how to pivot and when to pivot and what we can do for kids is like a big piece of it. So I want to thank you for that, Dominic, because we do agree on that. Big cheers. Faith, do you have the cheers button for that one?
I have
Thank
it.
Faith
you.
always has her cheers
I
button. She's
have it.
Well,
So
I must say, I'm assuming we might have to finish soon.
yes,
Otherwise, there's a danger I might need to go to bed. You know, but certainly, what impresses me about the setup you've got here and is that these are properly robust conversations, aren't they? And they are. I think that's what we need. I think we need it at system level as well. I'm really pleased that you have wide reach. It sounds like, but I think we need some some more of these frank conversations, getting policymakers and researchers and teachers and head teachers, people with all different kinds of knowledge in the room, and make them genuinely be open-minded, listen to each other, and try and arrive at consensus. I'm fortunate to be working with various governments in different ways. Some of governments are doing this really well, whereas I have to say, in other places, the attitude is, well, we've decided what works. We're now only going to listen to those people who continue to say what we think is right. And I honestly think that really is the danger of that, is this pendulum thing, isn't it? And it doesn't work. We have to be more grown up about it, I think. And of course, the media, I'm afraid, sometimes really doesn't help in all of this. They want to fuel the reading wars because it makes good copy, they think, and so on. But yeah, so I just want to say thank you very much indeed.
Would you call BS on the media? We want to hear what you would call BS on.
I call BS on the algorithm. The more you watch the BS, the worse your algorithm gets, Faith.
Yeah, good point.
Before you go to sleep, just tell us what you would call BS on and what you would give a big cheers to.
Okay. I'm going to give a BS to some people's views that if you encourage children to try and work out what a word means, that is fruitless guessing. It came up a little bit earlier today, and I didn't get a chance to talk about it. But to be honest, when a child comes across a word they don't know, yes, they do need to use as much knowledge of the alphabetic code as they can. That's without doubt. But if they don't check, hang on a minute, is that a word I know in my oral vocabulary? Do I know what that word means? Yes, I think I do. I bet to check that I really do need to look at the sentence. This is the only way to read. And you mentioned the cognitive scientist who wrote Reading at the Speed of Sight earlier.
Mark Seidenberg. Yes.
Yeah. His earlier work with McClelland, of course, had a rather nice model that to me looked like, the classic semantics, syntactics, and graphophonics almost. So that's my bullshit is for crude ideas that guessing, as it's called, is wrong. What's my praise for? My big praise, is for countries and regions who are genuinely taking an open-minded approach to this. I'm fortunate to work with the Republic of Ireland. Oh my goodness, the way they have gone about redeveloping their primary curriculum is world-class, genuinely world-class in my view. I've started some work with the Welsh government. They're, I think, also doing some really interesting things. We've got a long way to go. And there are other parts of the world as well who are not, bending down to the media furore. They're not being bullied by some narrow-minded politicians. They're saying, right, let's take a principled view here. Let's properly look at evidence. Let's get in a room together as grown-ups and mature people and discuss something that's important, really important. But, if you put it alongside things like, I don't know, half the world's children destitute, in poverty, and the terrible things that happen to too many children in rich regions as well, we need a sense of perspective on this, I think, on the debates. And then, we absolutely need to make progress. And hopefully one of the things that I'm doing with my colleagues is some of that stuff, which is, okay, let's seriously look at the evidence here. If we have to say something that some people might not agree with, we'll say it because we think that's the way the evidence is. I think we've had a period now where, if I can put it like this, synthetic phonics has definitely had the upper hand. England's a good example where it really has been given a very, very good try. And lots of aspects of it have been very important and I think have helped. But that doesn't mean to say we can't make some further changes now, build on that sensibly. But at the moment, the view is no, it's all perfect. And I'm sorry, that's not good enough. That really isn't good enough. And other regions.
Great conversation. And I have to tell you, when we first planned this, I was a little scared, and you're so charming and thoughtful and really reflective. This was a great conversation. And I think Judy and I absolutely agree that,
I think you know what, we didn't get deep into all of it, and I hope that we could speak to Dominic again, because I bet if I really got into this topic, because I'm really passionate about reading and meaning and all of that, we would have much more in common than not in common. I think if we really got granular and thought about it, of course meaning is important. Of course, a lot of decodables in the beginning aren't that enjoyable, but because of my training, because of my journey, because of following the research, I understand what I'm doing and why. And maybe some teachers don't. And yes, that could become dangerous if we're not following our kids and thinking about what's going on with all the kids in your classroom and how to pivot and when to pivot. I think it's tough. And Dominic, I hope that you were okay when I got a little bit emotional on the air. I hope I have the greatest respect for you. It's just like, my heart breaks sometimes because, I feel I failed so many kids in my journey as an educator that didn't learn how to read well. And I know as a practitioner, I got so much better because of, teaching kids how to decode and teaching kids how to slide. And I just don't want anybody, to think that that's not so helpful for so many kids when they're just learning how to read. Because I know, I was relying too much on meaning as a teacher. I was doing these picture walks and I was doing these multiple cues. And until I fully understood, how to teach a kid how to read, how to pivot, and then devoted my whole being to it,
We need to have another conversation. And
Fine.
Very good. But for those of you listening, Dominic Wyse's book is The Balancing Act. Follow his research.
We're going to put it on the show notes too, right, Faith?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
We're going to put all of that stuff in the show notes and so forth.
And he just came out with a new research just in December 2025. So I do hope everyone has an open mind, like he said, and, take a look. All right.
Well,
thank you again tonight. Thank you for doing this. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And it was thanks to you. No, by the way, Judy, absolutely no, I wasn't offended. And I think it's really important to clarify some of these genuinely important things. I recognize what you said about your journey. I haven't spoken about it today. I know quite a lot about reading recovery, actually, even though I was never trained in that way. So yeah, another conversation, another time may well be a good thing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.